Welcome back to It's Not Normal, the podcast, episode 45. In this week's episode, we're celebrating 1 year of the podcast. On October 6th of last year, I posted my first ever podcast episode. And it was only about 20 minutes long, and the setup was a bit different, but the intentions were the same. I had just sort of embarked on my healing journey. I was in the very early stages of realizing my childhood trauma, and I was reading and researching so much. I was learning so much about mental health and narcissism, emotional immaturity, and all of the things that experiencing that kind of behavior throughout childhood sort of lead to in adulthood. And it was answering a lot of questions for me in terms of why I was the way that I was. Where are these different behaviors and these intrusive thoughts coming from? Why am I having nightmares about this thing? And why does the thought of another person, another friendship, a relationship make me feel so anxious? Why am I resistant to change? All of these different things that were causing me a lot of grief in my day-to-day life, I didn't know where they came from for a long time. And so they had this power over me that was debilitating at times. I think it was so consuming. It would consume my thoughts. It would make it hard to focus sometimes on the things that I was actually doing. What I realized as I started to share my story on social media was that I was not alone in this experience. And I think when you are raised by an emotionally immature parent, or you're in any sort of abusive relationship, it can feel like a very solitary experience. Like you're the only person who's going through it or has ever gone through it, that no one would be able to understand or relate to you. And I remember in the very early stages of starting to share my story on social media, one of the things that was the most challenging for me was trying to figure out a way to tell my full story, to give anyone who wanted to listen an idea of my background so that they could understand how I got to where I was and why I was the way that I was, so that everything would make sense. Very quickly, I started to realize that the specifics of my particular story weren't nearly as important as the feelings that you sit with when you are raised by an emotionally immature parent, when you are manipulated by someone so close to you. Because you may not remember whether it was the time that you wanted to go over a friend's house or out to a movie, but you will remember what it felt like to be stonewalled by your parent. You may not remember the specifics of the argument, what you were fighting about that day, but you will remember what it felt like to be gaslit by your parent. And so it became so apparent to me that the specifics of my story and my background sort of took a back seat to the feelings that we sit with when we're raised in these kinds of environments. And understanding where these emotions come from and how they influence our behavior is so much more important. So I think the podcast has been a really great way to dedicate more time to these really complex and challenging topics and to really start to get to the bottom of them, because so much of healing is centered around self-awareness and understanding why we are the way that we are, so that we can start to trace those things back and move forward in a way that is not only more sustainable, but also more authentic to us. And so I kind of want to jump back into some of these earlier topics, because I've been getting so many memories on Instagram and on TikTok. 1 year ago today, you posted this video. And in revisiting those videos, it's shocking to me at times, the realizations that I was having as a 26-year-old adult, because they were so, looking back, they seem so simple, so foundational, and like, of course, they make sense. Things like, you're allowed to make mistakes. You are allowed to forgive yourself. You don't have to be okay with everything. You are allowed to set boundaries. All of these things were so new to me. And even after having only 1 year of healing and making an effort to implement these things into my relationships and into my personal life, it's clear to me how much more normal it is to live a life with forgiveness and self-acceptance and boundaries. These things make life so much better and more sustainable that revisiting these topics and these realizations that I was having makes it hard to believe that these things were not a part of my thought process for so long. I think to kind of build off of that, it's important to remember that it's never too late to change or to start to heal. And I think that that can be a really challenging thing to reconcile. Maybe that you haven't started to realize or process your childhood trauma until you were in your 20s or 30s or 40s even. I think looking at the different relationships that at one time were maybe really important to you that fell by the wayside because maybe you hadn't yet developed that self-awareness or that emotional maturity. Maybe you were projecting unhealthy behaviors that you had grown accustomed to throughout childhood onto an otherwise healthy partner, and subsequently creating problems that weren't there to begin with. I think all of these different things can sort of cloud our minds as we start to realize our trauma and acknowledge how it has affected us. But no matter your age, no matter where you're at in life, it is better to start to make an effort to heal today than tomorrow. And so I want to revisit the first episode, which was titled Feeling Bad for Getting What You Want. I remember sort of first learning about hypervigilance and that term, understanding that this was a behavior that was studied, that has articles written about it, that is mentioned in books. It was such a clear result of being raised by an emotionally immature parent that it was like a key for me. It unlocked so much of who I was at the time, so much of what my friendships were built on, my relationships with my parents. I had no idea about people-pleasing tendencies and self-neglect and the different ways that you show up in relationships when you're hypervigilant. That for me was sort of one of the first steps in developing some real self-awareness about the different ways that my childhood trauma had affected me and my behavior, the way that I was consistently conducting myself in different environments. And I think what's so wonderful, but also taxing about healing is having these different realizations and consistently sort of reframing your perspective of your life and your relationships and of yourself. You kind of have to consistently look in the mirror and ask yourself, okay, now that I know what this is, where does this come from? And now that I know where this comes from, how has this made its way into my life in ways that up until now I didn't know? But again, that is a process. I remember one of the first videos that I posted on TikTok that got millions of views, it completely caught me off guard, was talking about how if I want something, I expect my partner to know that I want that thing, when I want it, how I want it, without me ever having to directly communicate that to him. And I grew up thinking that that was completely normal behavior because that was what I was taught to do. That is what I was conditioned to do throughout my childhood. And in Adult Children of Emotionally Immature Parents, I reference this book so often because it is such a valuable resource for anyone who has gone through something like this. Lindsay Gibson talks about how one of the sort of trademarks of an emotionally immature parent is the phrase, "If you loved me, you would just know." And that was something that was ingrained in my thought process for as long as I can remember. I thought that love and care meant being able to read someone else's mind and to do the things that they wanted you to do, that they expected you to do, without them ever having to tell you. And that right there is one of the ways that we're conditioned to become hypervigilant throughout childhood, believing that if we want to show our parents that we love them and that we care about them, if we want to be a good kid, the way for us to do that is to constantly be paying attention to them, to these very minor shifts in tone and behavior, their mannerisms, to listen to what they're saying constantly and pick up on these little breadcrumbs of hints and clues. And from there, deduce our path forward, to understand how we're supposed to react, what we're supposed to say and do to make our parent happy. And I think one of the most challenging things about this as we move into adulthood and into our own relationships, if you don't understand that you yourself are hypervigilant, you may subconsciously expect that same hypervigilance from other people in your life, from your partner, and then be so disappointed when you don't get that because you think that that means that your partner doesn't love and care about you. Because we've tied these two things together. We've tied love and hypervigilance to one another throughout childhood. And so how can we possibly untangle these two things in adulthood before we even know what it is? And so discovering hypervigilance was so beneficial, not only in my personal life, but also in my relationship, because I started to realize that I was expecting hypervigilance from my partner. I didn't know that I could directly communicate with my partner. I didn't know that I could tell him, hey, this thing is really important to me, so can you make more of an effort to do that? Not only did I think that that was off the table, but I thought that if I did that, if I went out of my way to sort of lay this out nice and simple for my partner, I thought that that took the meaning out of the gesture, that it meant less because he couldn't read my mind. Like maybe something was fundamentally wrong in our relationship. Maybe you just don't know me the way that you're supposed to know me if we're so in love. That was kind of the idea that was introduced to me throughout childhood. If you loved me, you would just know. Realizing that I don't need to be a mind reader and not expecting my partner to be a mind reader makes things so much simpler. And again, sort of revisiting this idea and saying it out loud, it's hard for me to believe that at any time I expected my partner to read my mind, or that I thought that was a more sustainable way to maintain a relationship, like that was how we were supposed to communicate and function. On top of that, thinking that me directly communicating my wants and needs to my partner and him going out of his way to make an effort to do those things meant less because I had to say them, it's clear to me how manipulative that way of thinking is now. Because the truth of the matter is, it's the complete opposite. There's no way for someone, whether it's a friend or a romantic partner or maybe even a family member, to know you as deeply as you know yourself. They don't know all of your wants and needs and interests. They don't know what you want, when you want it, and how you want it. And that's not their responsibility. It's your responsibility to communicate those things to them. And then if they make an effort to do those things, how wonderful is that? How lucky are you? They are showing you through their actions that they're listening and that they care. But direct communication isn't something that's often practiced by emotionally immature parents. And so that is where we start to develop this hypervigilance. And I think one of the most exhausting parts of hypervigilance, of being hypervigilant, especially within the context of a relationship or any sort of social setting, is feeling like you are responsible for regulating the emotions and the mood, the overall energy, I guess, of other people. Because you are not in control of other people's emotions. You are not even in control necessarily of the environment that you're in, the conversations that are happening, the things that are being introduced. It's very unpredictable. Life flows in that way. And yet, I think for so many of us who were raised in these unhealthy environments, we can feel like it's our responsibility to make sure that everything goes well. And to take it one step further, I think something that we develop through childhood is sort of this ability to anticipate what's coming next. And in turn, how that thing is going to affect the mood of the people that we're around. And if we think that that might negatively affect this person's mood, then we're going to do whatever we can to kind of get in the way of what's coming next so we can make sure that everyone continues to have a good time. And something that I realized about hypervigilance is that it is such a form of self-neglect, because in those moments when all of your mental energy is focused on someone else, on people and circumstances that you cannot control, you're not really asking yourself, how am I feeling? Am I having a good time? Am I happy? I think for so many of us throughout childhood, that was secondary or non-existent. It's so common to feel like the adult in your relationship with your parent, and to feel like your personal feelings don't carry as much weight as your parents, because you're fine. You're fine with whatever. Don't mind me. I have to be here to help you. When you bring that into other relationships in your adult life, it doesn't allow you to show up as your authentic self, because you're so preoccupied with how everyone else is feeling, trying to figure out what everyone else is thinking. Are they having a good time? Am I saying too much? Did I recommend the wrong movie? Is no one enjoying this? I think all of these thoughts can really sort of get in the way of us being our true selves and giving other people the opportunity to see who that is. But it can be really easy, I think, to neglect ourselves, because throughout childhood, I think being raised by an emotionally immature parent, you are conditioned to believe that self-neglect is noble. But what happens when you never prioritize yourself is that you become more and more distant from your authentic self, from who you truly are. And that was one of the reasons that I started the podcast in the first place, why I started sharing, why I started Big Sis Casey, because I woke up one morning and I felt like I really didn't have a firm grasp on who I was, on my sense of self, on my identity. And in talking about self-neglect, I think you need a sense of self before you can develop self-worth. And I think once you get to the point where you have an idea of who you are and the kind of person that you want to be, then you can start to understand that you are deserving of love and friendship and happiness. And you can sort of put things in place that allow you to achieve those things. Whereas before you develop this sense of self, I think, it's so common when you're raised by an emotionally immature or a narcissistic parent to grow up feeling like you are an extension of them, like their wants and needs take precedence over your own, and that it's your responsibility to always put your parents first. And I think what happens when we do that so consistently for so long is that we don't develop our sense of self. And it can be that much easier to neglect ourselves when we don't feel in touch with ourselves, when we don't feel like we're deserving of anything. I saw a post one time on Instagram that was talking about how so much of healing from trauma is returning to your natural state. And I think about it visually as sort of your authentic self back here, and you've built up all of these defenses over the years to protect yourself and to cope with being manipulated by people that are so close to you. And so much of healing is just kind of breaking down those walls and only keeping the defenses that are necessary so that you can return to that more natural state. And so hypervigilance, for me, it became clear how that was a form of self-neglect. And yet it's so difficult to not develop hypervigilance when you're raised by an emotionally immature parent for a number of reasons. But one of the ones on the top of my list, I guess, is their style of communication. I, like I'm sure a lot of you, didn't feel like direct communication with my parent throughout childhood was allowed. I think emotionally immature parents use passive aggression sometimes as a means of communication. It is indirect and it's hurtful and it's confusing. It can catch you off guard and leave you feeling really on edge, like you always have to be aware of everything that's going on all the time. Now, understanding that I can directly communicate with my partner, it is so much more straightforward. It is so much more effective. And I think it's something that two people who truly care about each other will want to make an effort to do with one another. If you're working toward a common goal of teamwork, of resolution, of understanding, direct communication is your path to get there. And if you are both dedicated to that, then it's possible, it's achievable. And it's so satisfying to have those kind of exchanges with a partner, especially when you were raised in an environment where the opposite was so prevalent. I still sometimes find myself in experiences or different scenarios where my partner and I are interacting, and in my head, I hear my parents' reaction. I know what they would say and the way that they would say it, and how manipulative it would be, how hurtful it would come across, and ultimately how not productive it is to the conversation or to the relationship or the task at hand. Imagine you and your partner have a shared responsibility, something that you both take on and contribute to. But your partner has been slacking. They haven't been doing it as often, and you start to notice. There are two paths that you can take here. And I think when you're raised by an emotionally immature parent, the path that you may subconsciously follow in adulthood is one of indirect communication and passive aggression. So you might say something to your partner if they come up to you and say, hey, you've been doing this a lot. Thanks for that. You might say something like, well, someone's got to, because you've mentally been logging the amount of time that they haven't been doing this thing. And rather than telling them that directly, each time that goes by that they're not doing this thing, you are getting more angry. The resentment is building and building and building until it comes to a head in this passive-aggressive statement. Your other path is one of direct communication, which is so much better. Your partner's slacking, you start to notice. As soon as you notice, you say, hey, I've noticed that I've been doing this a little bit more than you have, so can you just kind of help me out with that? Great. Now, I do want to say that there are certain instances, depending on the person that you're dealing with, where that style of direct communication may not be effective. For example, if you're dealing with an emotionally immature parent or person, they may not respond to that direct communication. This is more specifically for people who are dedicated to making an effort to working together as a team. Maybe your partner is forgetful, and so you guys can work together and figure out a way to help remind the other person so that you both feel like you're pulling your own weight. Because at the end of the day, there is a common goal of compromise and of feeling seen and heard. Emotional maturity, I think, makes empathy feel like second nature for people. But so many of us weren't taught that throughout childhood. We weren't exposed to that kind of behavior, which is why I think it's so important to talk about these different things and to understand that just because that is how you grew up, it doesn't mean that that is how you have to live the rest of your life. There are a couple of other things that I want to touch on for this recap of 1 year of It's Not Normal. One of them is validating our trauma responses and these different behaviors that we develop throughout childhood as a means of coping with the toxicity that we are exposed to. Just because I understand more about mental health and emotional immaturity, and I've unpacked a lot of my childhood trauma, doesn't mean that I don't slip up. It doesn't mean that I never have a relapse of bad behavior and act in a way that I'm not proud of. There are times when, in light of controversy, I still get defensive and have a hard time admitting fault. There are times when a new person is introduced into my life and I'm flooded with anxiety and intrusive thoughts. And something that's been really important for me in moving through these emotions as they make their way to the surface is validating them and understanding that while they may not be serving me in a positive way now, they may not be healthy to carry forward. At one time, they were necessary. They were ways for me to protect myself. This has been super beneficial when it comes to self-acceptance and sort of acknowledging my flaws and not beating myself up over my mistakes too much, because that's something that I think so many of us can do. It can be so easy to beat ourselves up over the way that we are and the things that we do wrong. Oh, I hate that I feel this way. I can't believe that I did that. I think it's really important to remember that we developed these, when you think about it, these skills and these tools to navigate emotional landmines, this really volatile and at times explosive environment. I think the unpredictability of being raised by an emotionally immature parent is so draining and so exhausting that it prompts us to develop a lot of these different defenses. Validating these emotions has allowed me to create a bit of a distinction between my emotion and my reaction, because they're two different things. And I think there's nothing wrong with experiencing any kind of emotion, and it's important to allow yourself to feel them. But I think our emotions can sometimes fuel our reactions. We can begin to project them onto other people and maybe say or do things that we don't really mean, that are a little bit hurtful, that are out of line, especially when we're facing a more challenging situation. Maybe something triggers us. Maybe something feels very similar to a time that we were manipulated throughout childhood. And so we feel like we have to defend ourselves. We have to protect ourselves. But you don't have to allow that to kind of fuel your reaction. You can recognize it, you can process it, and sit with it once you validate it. That has been really helpful for me. That's something that I'm consistently working on because I don't always recognize when that's happening in the moment. I think it can be really overwhelming when you're caught off guard by something that feels eerily similar to a past experience of yours, something that reminds you of your trauma. But we move forward and we continue to do our best with the tools that we have. And before I wrap up this week's episode, I just want to take a minute to thank everyone who is tuned in and everyone who has sent their story and encouraged me or supported me in any way. There are times when I doubt myself still in so many different aspects of life, including this one. And I get overwhelmed at the thought of the amount of content, for lack of a better word, that I've put out there. How much of my face and my thoughts and my words are publicly available for anyone and everyone to see. And every single time I get a comment or a message or an email from someone that says, I just found your podcast and I'm binging it from the beginning because this is exactly my experience. I feel so much less alone, or this is exactly what I needed to hear right now. Those kind of messages are always what I go back to in those moments of self-doubt. When I feel overwhelmed, even sometimes timing-wise. It's Wednesday night. I had such a busy week and I was putting the podcast off and it's so easy sometimes. It can be so easy sometimes to just say, you know what? I'm not going to do it this week. I've got too much going on. But I go back to those thoughts and I think, you know what? This is a really important conversation that we're having. And it's a responsibility that I'm happy to have taken on because from the very beginning with the podcast and with everything that I've shared, I think about a younger version of me coming across something like this on an Instagram reel and having a whole new world of possibilities and understanding and self-acceptance opened for me. And that, I think, is all the motivation that I need to continue doing this. And so with that, I'm going to be wrapping up this week's episode of the podcast. Happy 1 year of It's Not Normal. If you enjoyed this week's episode, please be sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel on YouTube. If you're listening on Spotify, please be sure to leave us a rating. I will be back next week with another episode of It's Not Normal, the podcast. Bye.